Welcome, everyone. Welcome to finally our event that we were planning for such a long time. Welcome to the Symposium of Global Governance, organized by the Department of Global Governance at the Institute of the Foundations of Law. My name is Ksenia Radchenkova. I will be moderating this event. Jürgen Pirker, the head of the Department of Global Governance. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be able to welcome you in Graz this time in person, as last time our symposium was held in the last peak of the pandemic and it forced us to go into the virtual space. This time it's the post-pandemic phase and we already re-experience what we've missed so long, getting stuck in Frankfurt for the one hand, but on the other hand, we also learned from the pandemic, and this time we will have the symposium as a kind of a hybrid event. It will also be streamed online, so people participate in this event also online. So I will start with a triangle that will try to elaborate more on this research agenda that we are following. Global governance has become, as we discussed last time, a term that is frequently used in legal and political context. It refers to various legal, social, or political instruments of governing that can be institutionalized or not, and it refers to social realities on the local, national, transnational, or international level. So many concepts fit under the umbrella of global governance, and it can be conceptualized differently in different disciplines. In political science, with a focus on international relations or politics, different than the concepts from economics, sociology, philosophy, or law. To give some examples, global governance might be understood as a concept to address global change. It might be used to explain or create a model for the process of establishing international institutions. It might be understood as a process of cooperation of actors. It might be understood as the management of common affairs of individuals and public or private institutions. It can be understood as norms and policies that define and mediate cross-border relations among citizens, societies, markets, and states in the international order. From a legal perspective, global governance might be useful for studying the interactions and transitions of multi-level regulatory systems from the perspective of international law. It might be useful as a concept to analyze the interdependence of constitutional, supranational, and international regimes of human rights protection. It might be used in European law to research and conduct research on the principles, processes, and institutions that tackle global challenges for the EU and its member states, or with regard to legal theory, it might be useful to use global governance to come up with a new methodological framework that is taking into account the specific legal histories, the societal and economic context, and the respective conceptions of legitimacy. In a nutshell, global governance is a term originally borrowed from political sciences that poses many challenges for legal science. In our department, we address global governance as a kind of a multidisciplinary research program by taking on a specific approach of law and governance. And this approach, first and foremost, includes questioning the perspectives and perceptions of global governance. So apart from asking what we understand as global governance, we might also question, to put it in simple terms, whose global governance are we talking about? It seems that there's a dominance not only of states belonging to the Western Hemisphere within the institutions of the United Nations, there is also a dominance of Western legal and political thought that is currently challenged by scholars from all around the world and mainly the Global South. So required is thus a deeper inquiry into epistemology as a prerequisite not only for legal and political thought, but making sense of the world. This can be done by studying religious and philosophical traditions underpinning legal and political concepts and their consequences. So we could study the roots in Christianity, Judaism, Enlightenment, Confucianism, and contrast them against each other. This calls for historical and developmental analysis of terms and concepts as a basis for understanding global governance in an intercultural context in order to enable cultural, academic, scientific exchange about systems and perceptions. This leads me to the topics and research questions we deal with. They center around problems that have a global dimension, but on the other hand demand a very context-sensitive solution from a regional perspective. We thus set the focus on the one hand on studying human and minority rights protection. So research is dedicated to the contexts and narratives underlying the protection and effective enforcement of human and minority rights on national and international level. Additionally, we focus on conflict transitions and peace building, where we explore causes and dynamics of local, national, international, transnational, and international conflicts, and we challenge paradigms of peace building and conflict transition. And finally, our research is dedicated to theories and approaches underpinning political institutions, the functioning and the development of the rule of law and democracy, transnational and regional processes of integration, as well as a comparative analysis of political systems and constitutions. These areas we research are interrelated, and in order to research them, we have to bring together the analysis of the development of legal systems and their functioning, the shifts in power relations, and conflict resolution. To follow this multidisciplinary research agenda requires to incorporate approaches not only from law, but also from political and social sciences, economics, and humanities. And this is what we are going to do today. So we understand global governance as a kind of a perspective on structurally comparable problems and processes for which we have identified several central problems in the global order to be discussed today. And such problems are the changes in the geopolitical relations of the great powers, which in turn have consequences for local normative orders. They have consequences for the protection of minority and human rights. They have consequences for rule of law and democracy, and they have consequences for the functioning of regional integration processes, especially if we look at them from the perspective of Europe. Peace and conflict studies, in addition, provide a necessary complementary approach to address these challenges for global governance and to address their consequences, specifically in conflicts, since inter- and transnational law, as we see from the global context, but also in the European Union alone, is not sufficient to deal and resolve these conflicts. So one underlying dimension of our approach to global governance is to explain and contribute to solving conflicts at the international level. This requires, finally, the understanding of the interrelationship between law on the one hand, now broadly referring to institutions, structures, and norms in society, and on the other hand, the political, social, economic, and cultural context of these norms that leads to diverging epistemological concepts and worldviews as a prerequisite for really conducting what we consider as a substantive and sustainable dialogue. So the panels of today's conference will thus tackle the concept of global governance from three different perspectives. The panels will try to unpack global governance, and the first panel will deal with the trends of legal governance, with system building in multi-level frameworks, with the emergence of new alliances of systems and new legitimacy building in the global order. It will deal with what is probably also the dawn of a new order. And we will do this, and please allow me to say this from a very European perspective, by contrasting Eastern and Western perspectives. Thus, we will explore the Belt and Road Initiative as an example for perceptions of global governance from the Chinese perspective. We will deal with regional perspectives for the future of global governance in Eurasia, and we will contrast them against US ideas on the international order. Learning about these different perspectives, we might then ask for the role of law in shaping this new order. So additionally, the dialogue of systems is to be understood as a kind of a complementary necessity to build peace when law fails. And this means to examine and understand the historical, cultural, ideological, the legal, historical foundations of the respective political systems and the worldview of their actors. The second panel will then examine the protection of human and minority rights from the perspective of the European Union on the one hand, and the European Union is often considered to be a role model for global governance. We will, of course, test this assumption. And on the other hand, we will deal with the Council of Europe's institutional framework and with the substantive European parameters of justice by tackling inequality, by analyzing European and EU standards in their internal and external dimension. Thus, we will hear and learn about the democratic costs of economic inequality. We will question the European Union's consistency in the protection of human rights in the internal and external dimension, and we will test the transformative potential of the Council of Europe's Venice Commission. Finally, in the last panel tomorrow, we will take a closer look at innovations at the international peace architecture. We will open the field for peace and conflict studies, and we will analyze concepts of transitional justice, politics of peace and justice, as well as gendered, racialized, and militarist politics of peacekeeping. So while the areas covered by the first two panels can be understood kind of vertically, and we see that many problems that arise at the global level may be already mirrored in the regional level, the added value is to have this synopsis of these two dimensions that is then enriched by a complementary approach of conflict research. The geopolitical context that we will examine in the first panel is essential for understanding law, for understanding its interpretation and application between and within states. We address global challenges from a global as well as local perspective to come up with different approaches and solutions for conflicts in multi-level systems. For the one hand, in an exchange of different perspectives, but this exchange of perspectives requires an understanding of the methodologies and disciplines and instruments covered within the third panel. So in the end, the conference should provide a very round picture of what we are trying to do using the term global governance. Finally, let me get back to our global governance sujet. It's the globe with the hands that symbolize a connection and represent mutual exchange. And I wish us a very fruitful exchange during these 2 days. Thank you and welcome again.
Thank you, Jürgen. The first panel will be dealing with international order and governance between multipolarity and universality. The introduction for the panel will be brought up by Professor Benedikt Harzl, professor at the Center for East European Law in Eurasian Studies, at the University of Graz. Benedikt is an excellent expert in Eastern European studies and international law. Benedikt, please.
Well, thank you so much, Xenia, for this very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, what a nice, superbly nice privilege, I must say, to be able to moderate and introduce this very first panel. I do not mean to exaggerate if I say that we do have an intellectually stimulating treat for you with this very first panel, which is titled, as you can see, International Order and Governance between Multipolarity and Universality. Before I start to introduce our dear colleagues and guests and friends, allow me just some brief thoughts that may help to clarify our approach to this overall topic and to the corresponding panel that you are about to enjoy. Our approach, it's already been said by Jürgen, by the Dean, and inspired by Joseph Marco, of course, was always one that was looking both at law and politics as deeply intertwined dimensions. Well, on the one hand, we can say that this is actually quite trivial, right? I mean, it's even a non-brainer, because on the one hand, law shapes politics, and law is an important prize in the political struggle, including the international political struggle. But we claim that this law and politics approach goes even deeper and further if we look both at the international order and the dichotomy or the dichotomies between universal principles and multipolar orders, and allows us to gain even more and better insights. The Russian invasion in Ukraine, which I believe is also going to be addressed in these 2 days, probably by all of us, is a very helpful case in point, illustrating this approach amidst the background of multipolarity and universality. Now, if we employ just a legal analysis or a legal level of analysis, our assessment is straightforward, is quite obvious. The Russian invasion in Ukraine is a blatant violation of the prohibition of force. The most important textual frame that is at our disposal is, of course, the United Nations Charter, which proclaims in its Article 2, Paragraph 4, that not only the use of force in international relations is prohibited, even the threat thereof is prohibited. It constitutes thus a situation that would authorize the United Nations Security Council to determine the existence of a breach of peace or the existence of an act of aggression pursuant to Article 39, and it would furthermore authorize, some would even say oblige, the United Nations Security Council to adopt measures under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Now, that Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council has also given rise to some interesting discussions whether it's actually lawfully one. Right? So we are having discussions pertaining to state succession. We've also had plenty of discussions on other issues, such as the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. Interestingly, for the abduction of civilians, not for the elephant in the room, which is the act of the proverbial elephant in the room, which is the act of aggression. So upon cursory inspection, very first cursory inspection, I must add, law employs and displays a binary nature. It differentiates between lawfulness as opposed to unlawfulness. It asks whether a certain rule does apply in a certain situation or whether it does not apply. So with astonishing ease, we can say Russia has violated international law. The jus ad bellum, jus in bello fully applies. The competence of the ICC partly applies. But then at the same time, and here it is so relevant for the interplay between universality and multipolarity, it is increasingly seen, accepted by the academia, by the scholarly community, that international law is not a monolith. The rules set forth in international law, both in treaties and customary international law, were, are, and will continue to be an object of contestation, of interpretative contestation between states, and that the truly and always existing plurality of international law conceptions just appears to have been briefly overshadowed by post-1989 or post-1991 conception of universality. I pledged also to ISTE that I'm not going to mention Fukuyama today, because mentioning Fukuyama is tantamount to flogging a dead horse. But I have something else. Charles Krauthammer, the legendary Charles Krauthammer, who once raised the idea of the unipolar moment. But still, those different contesting conceptions of principles in international law have been there with us for quite a long time. I have a Russian textbook on international law with me, a standard textbook that you get at any Russian university, Международное право, and it's not been published last year, but 20 years ago. And it reads, and I'm just going to read it out just to make this point, at one point, that физические лица не являются и не могут являться субъектами международного права, which means that individuals cannot be under any circumstances subjects of international law, which is a very assailable position from a Western point of view, an extremely assailable position. So now, how can you, by using law, justify this frontal assault of Russia against Ukraine? I've been observing interesting discussions in the Security Council, and Russia has often used the tu quoque argument. You're not better than we are. You did it in other places, right? So it's a very unlegal way of defining things. But lately, and there is a very concerning development, I've overheard also Russian officials paraphrasing an admittedly obscure formula that Western states have often used in justifying certain actions, which is illegal but legitimate. Illegal but legitimate, which is obscure, not only obscure, but is also unhelpful because it does not clarify the question of who precisely is authorized to pass judgment on what is legitimate and what is not so legitimate. And I claim it's very concerning because the international law system is based on reciprocity and self-help, and we see how perceptions play a fundamental role. And these issues also affect, probably even to a much higher degree, the politics part of law and politics. Now, what does political science do? I mean, it asks how political decisions come into being, how they emerge, what consequences they have. Political sciences can be descriptive, analytical, sometimes also normative, even though Hans Morgenthau once wisely cautioned us to not always to champion a cause when you do publications, right? Because of the empirical nature of political sciences. And that, of course, begs the question, well, if we say political science determines or makes observations that ought to be based against reality, what reality are we dealing with? What kind of, how does reality come into being? And again, if we talk about Ukraine, we can break these competitions or contestations of reality down into competing realities that also constitute bedrock assumptions of certain scholarly theories in international relations, and very much dealing with perspectives. Now, for instance, now probably we are also going to discuss this in this very first panel, are we dealing with an egalitarian world order that embraces the notion of sovereign equality, which are also famously enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the United Nations Charter? Or are we actually dealing with something which like a social hierarchy in international relations between great powers and not so great powers, with the first resorting to force against the latter if an existential threat, whatever that means, is materialized? Another set of reality clashes. Are we engulfed by a liberalist worldview that not only allows but furthers and rewards cooperation, integration, even the pooling of competences? Or are we actually moving into a structural realist way of thinking, the kind of messy realism, right, that has as its bedrock assumption survival, military capabilities, and the fact that states do not trust each other in international relations and can never be sure about the intentions of other states? That helps us to explain why states today cherish uncompromising hard sovereignty for themselves. So is it probably Filippo English school as some way of bridging certain bedrock assumptions? To put a long story short, one of the most important challenges that we face when we talk about multipolarity is how states, but including how the scholarly community, will adjust to these changes and what consequences it will beg for global governance. If multipolarity is on the horizon, and I believe there is dramatically compelling empirical evidence to that effect, if that is really the horizon, then the patterns of politics, and I also claim the patterns of our theories, will need to dramatically shift from what we are used to after 1945. And that is important from a practical point of view. We require theoretical underpinning. And of course, in this context, we could have focused on a myriad of different research questions, but we decided to put the high beams on three highly interesting and selected topics, and allow me, therefore, to extend a warm welcome again to Jingxia from Renmin University of China, who will give a talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and certain implications thereof. This will be followed by our friend Filippo Costa Buranelli from the University of St. Andrews, who will, as we have already heard, problematize Eurasia. And finally, last but not least, of course, I also welcome our colleague and dear friend Jason Moyer from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., who will talk about the international order and will provide a very welcome view from Washington, D.C. So how are we going to proceed in this panel? Every panelist will be given plenty of time. That's really very good to have, I think, really a sufficient time budget for his or her remarks. And afterwards, you see that there is, I think it's indicated, it's discussion, which gives me a bit the prerogative to have some humble remarks. But probably we could already open, limited discussion, but still at the end of the panel, we are going to have an overall summarizing Q&A. I'm going to introduce both the speakers and the corresponding topic more in detail, of course, separately. And we start our discussion with Jingxia Shi. Jingxia is Professor of International Law at Renmin University of China. She's a renowned expert in the field of international comparative bankruptcy and reorganization law and is a prolific writer who has extensively published on matters pertaining to the Belt and Road initiative, which is really front and center in, if I may say, in your scholarly activities. And I should also say that she holds an LLM degree and a JSD degree from Yale Law School and a PhD degree from Wuhan University. And she's a member of the New York Bar and the Chinese Bar Association. She will be going to address the Belt and Road Initiative and will analyze how, to what extent, to what degree, an initiative that is also sometimes quite critically being discussed and seen, how this initiative will contribute to the successful transition to a global economic governance. Jingxia, welcome to Graz. We are very much looking forward to your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Okay, when you put on my PPT, maybe I have several words before my speech. That's a very nice introduction by Benedikt. Thank you so much. It's my great honor to be here in Graz University. As Dean has just put it, it's maybe not official ranking #1 law school in the country, but it is wonderful. Just to give you an example, because PPT is not on yet. I was in Amsterdam during the weekend for a III annual conference. That's my field on international insolvency law. At the end of the conference, I was asked by a judge from Eastern District of Bankruptcy Court based in Brooklyn, New York, and her justice asked me where I'm heading for. I said, I'm going to Graz University for a workshop on global governance. She said, oh, that's a very famous university. I don't know how. She's a bankruptcy. She's a world-renowned bankruptcy judge based in Brooklyn, New York. And she said, Graz University is a very famous university, and the law school is world-renowned law school. So just to give, this testimony, not from me, but anyway, it's so, I'm so grateful for being invited and talk with you about Belt and Road Initiative. This year marks the 10th anniversary of, I called, for short, it's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. It was once called One Belt, One Road Initiative, and then rephrased as BRI. So I'm going to use BRI. So in the next, I believe, no more than 20 minutes, I'm speaking about several aspects. Basically, it says as it's 10 years. So what has happened in the past 10 years? It's basically like a brief stock taking of the BRI initiative. I would say, even there is some statistics. Actually, a lot of statistics. You can see, basically like an impact and influence from the monetary perspective, how much investment China has been done in the past 10 decades. But after 10 years, nowadays, we have seen extremely complicated and mixed feeling about the BRI. It was portrayed from so many perspectives. I would call it as a very fixed feeling about this initiative due to various reasons. So this comes to my second presentation. I'm briefly examine the problems and the challenges faced with the BRI nowadays. There are a lot of aspects to talk about the challenges, but I'm going to mainly focus on the ever-increasing, intensified geopolitical rivals, particularly between, not only between China and the U.S., but between China and the U.S. and its allies. So what does this mean for international and Chinese domestic law legal system? After all, we care about law. So it's a law. It's a nice slogan here. I also touch upon, the more recent challenges faced with the BRI, particularly resulting from the COVID. Maybe you have experienced like couple of years, but in China it's completely 3 years lockdown. So it's a kind of disaster. It has brought about a lot of, I think, impact on the further implementation of the BRI in the next years. So in terms of the global governance, I realize, my paper should be contributing to, how to make the global governance even better. So I want to put forward a proposal towards a more sustainable relationship. This has been related to the challenges faced with the BRI nowadays, not only nowadays, but future challenges. And this sustainable relationship is not only required by the internal needs for China for its development in the next years, if it wants to exert a positive negative on global governance, particularly on economic governance. And also this comes from the outside peer pressure from other countries. But I conclude that I think the implementation of the sustainable development holds the key for a successful and bright future for the BRI. In terms of the global economic governance, I think time is limited, so I just put forward some rough ideas. Basically, for the taking a stock about 10 years BRI's development, we can see, that I think it's a common knowledge that BRI comprise of two components: the Silk Road, basically about land road, and also the maritime Silk Road. So as the end of the last year, BRI already extended to almost 150 countries. This is being said from the basically from the memorandum of understanding signed by China and its so-called BRI partner countries. So the money, as you can see, there is a statistics from a different angle, but money, I just list one statistic. You can see it's a huge. It involves huge amount of money China has invested in the BRI. And in single year, China invested more than 20 billion in so-called non-financial direct investment. Basically, it's a FDI in infrastructure. Since its inception, BRI aims to connect the Chinese economy to those states through most of the developing countries. It has listed so-called 56 or around 60 so-called BRI countries along the two routes, one land road, one the maritime road. but it has been emphasized. BRI is open to every country in the world, including, the U.S. and the Western countries. It's open. It's intentionally. It's announced that it's open to every country in the world, every organization in the world, as long as they have maintained interest. So BRI used in reality, BRI has used a number of economic instruments, including now already existing so-called BIT, bilateral investment treaties, and also FTA. China has been negotiating 26 thus far FTA, most of them with BRI countries. So this framework aims to support infrastructure. This is the so-called infrastructure connectivity between China and other countries for the development, infrastructure development. There are a lot of also energy projects. You can see this infrastructure investment concern, a lot of high risks. Just list several key projects. It's mainly in Asia, South and Eastern Asia, and South and Central Asian countries. And beyond that, also a lot of projects ongoing in African countries. This is a so-called port city, Colombo port city. It was questioned as it's a new Dubai or a Chinese enclave by a BBC correspondent. So as you can see from the picture, it's built on the so-called reclaimed land. A very mixed feeling, as you can see from, if you look at the response from many channels, from many persons with respect to this project. This is in Sri Lanka. It's a so-called port city project. This is the largest ever for FDI project in Sri Lanka thus far. It involves internal political struggle. I mean the domestic elections, the change of the governmental, and corresponding to the development of this project from Chinese companies. So a brief, I don't think I have time, briefing on it. But suffice to mention that this project encounters, the very positive response from some channels, but also very negative response from other channels. So the negative impact, mainly, the good side, the positive, you can see is contributing to the local economic development of Sri Lanka. It's going to be host so-called a lot of international, multinational cooperation, the financial organization model after Dubai or, some Hong Kong, Singapore, these kind of places. But on the other side, it caused so-called a lot of environmental concern. Not only beyond that, so also some social concern in Sri Lanka by this huge project. Also, you can see a lot of projects ongoing in African countries. Coming to my central point for this part, after 1 decade, we have seen, BRI encounter a very mixed feeling. There has been several attempts to categorize BRI as, the Chinese version of Marshall Plan or debt trap diplomacy, and etc. So also from, some Chinese scholars, even from my own personal perspective, I also think, BRI actually has not worked out as originally planned to some extent. Furthermore, there are challenges, resulting from COVID. COVID has cast a very negative impact on Chinese economy in the past 3 years, and also you can see this going to last for the, I think, for the next at least some years in the next. So how much China can invest in, as it did before, remains a question mark. And also, we have seen, ever intensifying geopolitical tensions, a lot of counterback against this initiative. Also, I try to, in my future paper, I try to analyze from the legal law and the development perspective, the challenges, I think I also talk about, some already in my first part. Basically, I think, closely related to the theme of the future book. I think BRI right now, it encounters a word from unipolarity to multipolarity. It's related to multipolarity and universality, but I use, this is a transition from unipolarity, meaning, U.S. has dominated since World War II in terms of the global economic governance, and now, China has been rising. China has been rising as a power. Some portray as a hegemon, although Chinese doesn't like this word, but it has been rising power. It's a reality. So from the government, global governance, I think, the shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, it is characterized by several things, a diffusion of power. We have to realize this reality, and also this brought many challenges to the international legal order, and including the changing notions of sovereignty and identity, and for the world, including China, in implementing its BRI in the next stage, there is a need to harness, better state and non-state capabilities for sustainable development. That's my, the central point in my future paper. I think time is limited, I realize, and I think, here I pose a critical question. I think this should be of a great interest to many scholars in this field. Is there a Chinese model of economic governance through the BRI after 1 decade? I think this is a very important and interesting question to me. We say, there is an old joke about the so-called Holy Roman Empire being neither Holy Roman or empire. So I'm saying this because there is the fear, a big fear, from Western countries. China has been posing a huge threat through implementation of its project to a global system. So this question is mainly about whether China has this capacity, even after 1 decade of the BRI's implementation. I myself, I'm an insider, kind of, doubtful. This, we realize, on the one hand, very important, on the one hand, with huge money putting into other countries through BRI projects, there has been impact from China to local, not only economic but also social, cultural, ideological, change to local. So I have some case studies. Just one, to briefly mention here. If you look at the BRI and Thailand, Thailand is an important trading partner, mutually important trading partner between China and Thailand. So quoting one professor from Thailand, he said, in terms of the China's impact on Thailand through the BRI after 1 decade, he used the phrase, very famous phrase in Thailand, same but different. So same in the sense that, same as Western countries, but several decades ago, Western countries has impacted Thailand in many fields. China has been doing this as well through the BRI implementation. So this is the same thing. But if you look closely, examine the phenomena, it's different. So basically, it means Chinese way the impact is cheaper in the sense that compared to past funding and the sponsorship from Western countries, Chinese institutions provide more modest funds to gather influence in legal and government, but the trend has been incremental increase in Chinese engagement and funding over the years. So the clear pattern of the Chinese law and development influence in Thailand. It has influence. This is not only in Thailand, but also in some Central Asia countries, including Kazakhstan, and also some African countries in South Africa. You see, I was given one example, during a conference from a scholar from South Africa. She's saying that, you don't know, the Chinese, the cyber security law has some impact on the local lawmaking. This is good or bad. I think this leaves a lot of questions to be asked if you know about China's cybersecurity law. This is one side I should emphasize, but on the other side, if you look at assessing China's BRI-related behavior, I think, particularly from the perspective of global economic governance, I don't think, China is capable at this time, right now, even after 1 decade of the BRI, China is capable of influencing, particularly through the law we call international treaties, free trade agreements, this kind of hard stuff compared to soft MOU format. So a lot of examples you can look at for AIIB is infrastructure. You invested a lot of infrastructure project for BRI, but it's dominated by it's led by China. But still, the AIIB has pledged to confirm multilateral development, has so-called best practice in this field. AIIB basically has no very, you can see so-called local or Chinese characteristics. It's very much a model after, World Bank, ADB, this kind of financial institution. Dispute settlement, right now, it's a lot of to look at it. China established the so-called International Commercial Court, CICC. I myself was a so-called first batch of the expert committee on this court. But compared to other international commercial court in the world, CICC has a long way to go. In its capacity building, also, if you can look at from its caseload. I think, the question here is, I just talk about the 3 years, lockdown for COVID. The question is, can BRI succeed to construct a model for economic governance against the coordinate counterbalancing from the US and its allies? So also the question, how should China address today's transnational challenges and contribute to economic governance in a multi-polar world? So for sustainable relationship, this is only one part because I undertake the top national so-called key research projects, which to be concluded by the end of this year. So I have a lot of proposals, but for this paper, I think most about so-called sustainable relationship. If you look at the statistics of the BRI concerned project, you will see how important it is to have a sustainable BRI for its long-term development. Particularly, the question is what kind of role the BRI can play in promoting environmental, social, and governance, so-called ESG standards. As I mentioned, China has been exerting influence in BRI countries, but this kind of impact has both negative and positive sides. So far, the reality is that still why I think the sustainability is important, because right now we have seen the very limited extraterritorial effect of BRI on ESG practices. This is also can be seen from the Colombo Port City project. You will see a lot of concern. Basically, here the question is, China respect the sovereignty of each participating BRI projects. So we China use the so-called host country standard. Basically, this, the host country standard has been picked as the recognition of states' sovereign equality and the rights to self-determinance. But the problem is that, BRI states, BRI countries are often, low and middle income economy. So they have relatively, not high standard. In this respect, I think China should adhere to internationally recognized standards, not only invoking to local standards. Another problem is that the implementation. When those standards are relatively soft, Chinese company maintain a relatively, not very good record about compliance. So there is, I think, a lot of work to do. Still about the problem with host country standards. And as a driving force behind the BRI implementation, China can offer the tremendous capacity and expertise in so-called green BRI strategy. But the problem is the implementation. The implementation of what kind of standard and how hard or how soft this implementation has been in reality. So those all are very important questions. Concluding remarks, I want to emphasize, in a multi-polar world, China's BRI, there should be some room for China's, the presence through the BRI implementation in many countries. You can see all in the whole world. I think this is a multi-polar world, so there should be some room. And in fact, the BRI implementation has been influencing many factors. You can look at from different angles in many BRI countries. But for the better global governance established through the BRI implementation, there shall be more sustainable relationship. This can be consistent with the network of investment treaties, domestic regulation, and the soft law mechanism. I also put forward several elements, but always implementation, particularly for Chinese stakeholders, particularly for Chinese like companies, implementation always holds a key. A lot of times you can see it's not the problem of the law, of the regulations themselves. It's about the implementation. So I always emphasize the sustainable development from the perspective of implementation. Thank you so much. I realize, I used up my time, but I'm open for Q&A. Thank you so much for your time.
We move to Eurasia. Well, we are already in Eurasia, if I may say, but we move in our presentation with Filippo Buranelli to the question of Central Asia. Allow me also briefly to introduce Filippo more in detail. Filippo is senior lecturer and associate professor in international relations at St. Andrew Universities in the United Kingdom. He's also an associate fellow of the Institute for the Study of International Politics in Milan, in Italy, and he has also served, and that's, I think, very interesting detail that I do not fail to mention, as the chair of the English school section at the International Studies Association between 2020 and 2023. And allow me just one quick detour. That's very challenging, I guess, because I always used to tell my students when I explain the English school, or when I try to provide an appetizer into the English school, I always used to tell them, just imagine to put Thomas Hobbes, Hugo Grotius, and Immanuel Kant in one room, lock the door, throw the key away, and say, we're only going to release you if you find some agreement. So my congratulations to your ambitions, if I may say. But which is, of course, half-jokingly, allow me also to say that Filippo's research interests are, of course, very much engulfed in international relations theory, international history, and his works have been published in very prestigious journals such as Europe, Asia Studies, International Politics, Problems of Post-Communism, and others. He will be talking about Eurasia, which is probably also already a title which is not free of some provocation and gives us some food for discussion. And we will learn more about the term embedded pluralism, I guess, understood as an acknowledgement of some shared rules, some lowest common denominators, while there is a coexistence of other culture, probably even civilizational differences. And you will do that with the example of Central Asia. Filippo, welcome to Graz. We're anxiously waiting for your presentation. Oh, thank you so
much. Okay, can you hear me? I guess yes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the lovely introduction and the lovely invitation to Graz. It's a great honor to be here and to present my initial thoughts on what I believe Eurasia is telling us about the future of global governance. I made very clear to the draft I shared with Benedikt that this is a first draft and that, of course, my thoughts are still evolving. And of course, I'd be extremely grateful for any inputs, comments, feedback, or suggestions for the work. This is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to provide you with some context and an introduction, and I will develop the argument and my approach in two different parts, specifying then the theory and the methodology adopted, ending up into the analysis and conclusions. I will try to do this in the 20 minutes allotted. And allow me to say from the very beginning that I believe that in some parts of this work, at least, there is a very fruitful and meaningful synergy and overlap between what I've been trying to do here and the remarks by the dean and the head of department made before. It is exactly this nexus between the politics and the law that very much interests me, the fact that we may say that the law without politics is mute, but also politics without law is blind. And we see this very much happening in Eurasia nowadays. Not just, of course, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is much more happening. Although, of course, that's perhaps the event that's catching most of our attention. So, as I've just said, Eurasia is at the center of several challenges in global governance, challenges to territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence and autonomy are, of course, in front of everyone's eyes. And I must say, not just from February 24th, 2022, but all the way back to 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and some may say even prior to that. There are other interesting trends, nonetheless, happening in Eurasia that I believe are intimately and inexorably linked with broader patterns of global governance. And here, spoiler alert, while Benedikt is right in saying that my focus is on Central Asia and Eurasia, it is exactly this relationship between the regional and the global that I'm trying to unpack and to try to see how they mutually enhance and entrench each other while also contesting and undermining each other. So the first trend that has been aptly discussed before in the previous presentation by Professor Xi is China's expansion in Central Asia through the BRI and not only, and the emergence of discourses around sovereignty in the area, in particular hard sovereignty, understood as constitutional insularity. Whether these are discourses that then differ from the practice is another matter. But what is interesting for me is this reemergence of very hard rock understanding of sovereignty, very much distinct and different from the sovereignty as responsibility norm that we have become used to hearing. There has been a huge increase in trade and infrastructural cooperation, certainly thanks to China, but also within the region itself with local actors trying to really get ownership of these projects. The repositioning of Afghanistan within the regional order after the departure, famous or infamous departure of Western troops from Afghanistan in 2021, and the slow acceptance, de facto, if not de jure, of the Taliban regime by the Eurasian partners. The inclusion of Iran in the regional order, I will expand on these even more, and the rise of informality, especially at the regional level, when it comes to business, but also politics, diplomacy, multilateralism, and so forth. And all these, I believe, it's trying to say something about the possible future directions of global governance. And I will, in the remaining part of the presentation, in the remainder of the presentation, expand on this. But I really want to insist on try to be courageous and try to look at what this may mean for the foreseeable future instead of how the past has been affecting Eurasia. Eurasia is a region or an area that has been very much subject to the curse of the past. In Eurasia, everything is due to the past, right? We see references to the new Cold War or even the old Cold War, Nazi Germany, the Thucydides trap as well. So in order to explain Eurasian politics, we may all go the way back to Greek city-states. But there is little discussion about the future. And I believe this is kind of understandable in epistemological terms, that to filter the present and the future through the prism of the past is kind of reassuring. But at the same time, I believe that we may want to free ourselves from this straitjacket and to see how these trends may say actually something about the future. And here, the caveat that I want to specify very well from the very beginning is that the future that I'm talking about should be plausibly imagined and not predicted. Okay? I'm not doing any sort of prediction here. I'm trying to plausibly imagine what these trends that we're observing at the regional level may be seen at the global level in the foreseeable future. And as a matter of fact, the presentation is structured around the idea that what we are observing in Eurasia is actually already visible at the global level. So there is a mutually reinforcing trend, as I said before, between the regional and the global. And this is the second bullet point, that the analysis is not causal. Okay? I'm not making any causal argument here. I'm not saying that what is happening in Eurasia is causing these big changes in global governance. It's actually hand in hand. Okay? And it's very difficult to understand where something starts in these trends, what is causing what. So I very carefully steer away from that, and I simply leave you with this idea that the regional and the global are mutually constitutive. And in order to do this, I adopt an English school approach to global governance. Benedikt is right. It's not often easy work to do, but I'm still here. The purpose is to look at global governance as an ensemble of processes, dynamics, and rules. And I very much like what the head of the department said before, both formal and informal. We often forget about this, but it's especially the informal that interests me. Sustaining a given regional order, and this is one of the key words of my presentation, which is supported by the operation of specific institutions. And this is the second keyword of my presentation. Okay? Institutions understood not in liberal or neoliberal terms, okay? So not only as formalized international organizations or formats, okay? But rather in a more sociological or anthropological terms. Understood then as durable and patent practices based on shared norms which regulate actions of states and define the legitimate actions and identities thereof. Okay? So this is the way in which I understand institutions in this presentation, and they will form the bedrock of my argument. So argument and approach 2, by looking at Eurasia, we can think of global governance as being reconfigured, okay? Alongside 3 main institutional changes. So I've just told you that I conceive of global governance as an order underpinned by these very big social practices and norms. Okay? This is what I call institutions. And it's also an order. Okay? So it's not just a sum of rules and norms and mechanisms. I like to say that it is not arithmetic, it's geometrical. It's not just a sum, there is a third dimension to it. And this third dimension is the normativity of it. Okay? Is the perception of the should, the perception of the rightfulness, the perception of the legitimacy. And it is exactly this normativity that is underpinning the institutions that I'm going to talk about today. What we're observing in Eurasia, and I will link this, I will never be tired of saying this, to the global level, is the resurgence of 3 very specific institutions, or if you prefer, practices, okay, the P word. Hard sovereignty as opposed to sovereignty as responsibility, informal regionalism as opposed to formalization, and what I call transactional developmentalism as opposed to liberal capitalism. Again, some overlaps with the previous presentation. I already said before that I understood global governance as an order premised on this idea of embedded pluralism. Okay? So embedded pluralism is a social structural condition, okay? is akin to a political theory understanding of global governance that is premised on the idea that not only we are observing an increasing diversity of voices, priorities, and practices, and I should say also interpretations of practices, okay? These very polysemic norms that we have out there, right? Sovereignty, human rights, environmentalism, that mean different things to different people. But this diversity is embedded, that is to say, constitutive of world order, and therefore is seen as desirable, durable, and to be protected, something to be maintained. Cooperation and coordination are slowly being preferred over integration and pooling of competences. And this process of moving towards embedded pluralism is very much sustained at the discursive, and one may say at the pragmatic level, by ideas of resistance, diversification, balancing, and anti-colonialism. Now, theory methodology. Global governance as order coming from an English school perspective. Normative elements. I said before, global governance is not just sum of rules and norms. There is a third geometrical dimension, the depth, okay? The normativity, the legitimacy, the acceptability of such norms and rules. Okay? Second, global governance understood in historicist terms. Global governance doesn't exist in a vacuum. Okay? It's not something that boomed like a big bang out there in 1990s. It's something that actually has very specific path-dependent roots in colonialism, exploitation, domination, and a very uneven distribution of power, both material and ideological, in history. And third, as I said before, global governance having institutional underpinnings. Okay? This idea of institutions which have very specific meanings and practices. And then I would say, the core argument of this presentation, that the global is always global from somewhere. Okay? So even if we speak of global governance as it's an indistinctive, seamless environment of rules, norms, understandings, procedures, agreements, compromises, there is always a local interpretation of it. There is always a local understanding, a local practice, a local contestation, embracement, rejection, reformulation. And this is why I wanted also to connect the global with a very specific regional domain. The global is always global from somewhere. And the way in which I understand the change in global governance that I exemplified before with these 3 different institutions arising, I understand change as change in the core discourses and practices attached to the specific institutions upholding it. And in order to do this, in the paper I engage with discourse and practice analysis to uncover exactly normativities, legitimacies, and preferences. And the caveat here, and maybe the excusatio non petita, is that my focus is pretty much state-centric, at least in this presentation. Actually, something for future work may actually be to unpack this state-centrism and to see also at the sub-state level or at the transnational level, in fact, how this is unpacking. There's a tiny justification for the methodological rationale for the study here. The fact that I don't really see language and practice as disjunct. Okay? This may be the old Wittgensteinian argument, but at the same time, I do see an inherent connection between language and the social practices we are engaged with in terms of how both legitimize and uphold each other. Language is not simply a medium for disseminating or registering information, but a critical vehicle for the construction of meaning, for generating identities, creating subjects and objects, and prescribing practices related to this. So now looking at Central Asia and Eurasia, and this return, if he ever went away actually, but this stronger and stronger emphasis on hard sovereignty is observable in 3 main domains. The first one is the fact that in the past 10, 15 years, all Central Asian states have resorted to constitutional amendments to exactly entrench sovereign constitutional prerogatives, territorial law, the hardening of borders, and for specifying that integration is only understood in economic terms, certainly not in political ones. Already in 2014, let alone after 2022, especially Kazakhstan, the country that shares the longest uninterrupted land border in the world with another country, Russia. I said uninterrupted because then you have to count the Canada-US one. Took measures, legal measures, to link its constitutional protection of territory, borders, and sovereignty to the United Nations Charter. And this is also observable in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Political control. Recently, at the Eurasian Economic Union Forum held in Moscow, the Central Asian presidents, represented by Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, president of Kazakhstan, re-emphasized that an excess of integration, i.e. he was referring to the union state between Belarus and Russia, is, and I'm quoting, a conceptual anomaly that needs to be addressed. That integration is only meaningful if it is confined to the economic realm, and that political prerogatives should be within the sovereign hands of the authorities of every single country. And this, of course, leads to a rejection of supranationalism, understood as not necessarily the rejection of creating international settings where to achieve cooperation and coordination, but it's the rejection of the delegation of sovereign powers to supranational bodies, as in fact has been suggested a number of times by President Putin within the Eurasian Economic Union when it comes, for example, to the single market or a common currency within the Eurasian Economic Union. And this trend, as I said before, I will try to navigate between the regional and the global, is being observed in other parts of the world. And in the paper, I look specifically at discourses of hard sovereignty within the African Union and ASEAN. Sovereignty is progressively linked to non-alignment, especially ASEAN countries last year issued declarations very much focused on the need to protect sovereignty, territorial integrity and to respect non-interference and non-intervention right after the Russians' invasion of Ukraine, but they never mentioned the aggressor. And I think this is very much interesting. Further analysis somehow revealed that these declarations, this discursive positioning within international relations and international law is mostly understood not for condemnation, but actually for the reaffirmation of a sovereignty norm at the global level. It's just to perpetuate its validity, leaving somehow this conflict between Russia and Ukraine to the great powers, understood as great power rivalry, as opposed to a threat to the world security order. The literature has also focused on how this return of Harzl sovereignty within the African continent is also encroaching on pan-ideas. Abrahamsen has done very good work on the way in which Pan-Africanism is now slowly being pluralized within the African continent and within the African Union itself, having now multiple voices, multiple understandings, and always linked to a specific nation-state idea as opposed to be a continental identity, even if still rhetorically used, of course, as a projection for independence and autonomy on the global stage. But within the African Union itself, it is still this idea of sovereignty that underpins even these pan-ideas. Last month, there was the Africa Day to celebrate the 60th anniversary of African integration. First started with the Organization of African Unity in 1963, and then evolved with the African Union in the early 2000s. The theme of the African Day was sovereignty. And the Africa Day celebration was attended by, interestingly enough, Russian officials who were there to liaise with African representatives and African statespeople to protect Africa from, and I quote, outside noise. An interesting way to frame neocolonialism or domination. African Union has also taken steps to ensure food sovereignty in direct opposition to what is seen to be Western responsibility for the disruption of supply chain and market infrastructure, given the dependency of Africa on foreign markets, especially when it comes to staples, grains, cereals, and basic food. More on this later. It is mentioned before, the International Criminal Court, the return of legal sovereignty as well. South Africa last month announced that it will apply its immunity and diplomatic, I can't remember the name of the law, but there is an act that basically can be conferred to foreign diplomatic personalities to basically provide them with diplomatic immunity. And President Putin apparently is going to enjoy this this summer when attending the BRICS meeting in South Africa. As far as I know, there is still some tension on this, so it's not for granted, but that's somehow the trajectory. And overall, one may observe a global South solidarity or upholding each other's sovereignty claims becoming more and more prominent. Maybe this is not fully pertinent to this presentation, but I also found very interesting that at Africa Day celebrations, a representative for Argentina was attending the meeting as well, in order to garner support for the Malvinas Falkland issue. So fostering this idea of global South transnational solidarity between different states in different parts of the world. I mentioned before that a second institutional change that we may observe more and more prominently in global governance in the future is a move towards informal trans-regionalism. And again, Eurasia is telling us a lot about this. There is a formal organization called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded in 2021, formalized in 2005, when Uzbekistan joined it. But this organization, formal organization, is now engaging more and more in informal activities, opening its door to non-member states, exactly to foster dialogue, compromise, synergies of minds, and we may say a common understanding on an alternative world order, on alternative normativities. The latest informal activity that the SCO carried out was the Food Security and Poverty Reduction Forum last month, very much set up and addressed, very much set up and organized to address problems, once again, that are believed in Eurasia to have been caused by Western sanctions on Eurasian territory, especially when it comes to poverty reduction and food security. Another example is the proliferation of 5+1 settings. The 5 Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, are rejecting more and more formalization of relations and are setting up this 5+1 that has been aptly described as the geometry of Central Asian informal regionalism to allow themselves to have meaningful dialogue and partnerships with great and middle powers, US, European Union, China, Russia, India, Japan, South Korea. But at the same time, not to allow any of them to encroach too much on their independence, on their balancing moves, on the way in which they ultimately want cooperation and coordination without formalizing these in formal structures that may encroach on their independence and sovereignty. And if there is a 5+1 setting, so inviting periodically an external member of the region, there is a 5+0 informal setting as well among the heads of states of Central Asia. And this was funded in 2018, and I'm quoting, to sink the watches on matters pertaining to the economy, politics, security, and diplomacy, development in the region, among the 5 states presidents only. And a third example is the informal meeting of neighboring countries of Afghanistan, that again was set up for the first time by Pakistan in 2021, right after the departure of Western troops from Kabul and the wider territory of Afghanistan, set up in deliberate opposition to G7 and EU approaches to Afghanistan, very much based on rule of law, minority rights, human rights, women's rights, and conditionality. And whereas this informal meeting of neighboring countries of Afghanistan is set on completely opposite normativities, is premised on internal order, is based on security, is based on development, is based on investments, is based on de facto recognition. None of the single Eurasian countries has formally recognized the Taliban, yet all of them as diplomatic representatives there and allow diplomatic representation of the Taliban on their own territory. They sign treaties, they sign commercial treaties. China has just signed a huge oil exploration treaty with the Taliban. So if it is not de jure recognition, this is certainly de facto. And at the global level, with this informal transregionalism, we are observing interesting progressions of BRICS and BRICS Plus platforms in taking ownership of global governance trends. One of them, most recently, the proposal of a peace plan for the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Another very interesting example of informal transregionalism at the global level is the increasing cooperation between Russia and ASEAN in the Russia and ASEAN informal format that meets once a year. And I was reading some statistics. This is the 4th year in a row that trade between Russia and ASEAN is actually increasing. And there is also the Russia-Africa Summit to be held this year. This will be the 2nd, underpinned by a mechanism for dialogue partnership that once again has contributed to a rise in trade and development a two-way, both for Russia and Africa, which is also one of the reasons perhaps why sanctions are only partly, if at all, working on Russia. A bit of color in this presentation, which was very dull in black and white only so far. The first graph is a very raw operationalization of this idea of the rise of informality in global governance. This is a graph taken by Biersteker, Abbott, and Westerwinter, 2020. And if you noticed, I mentioned mostly informal settings in the realm of development, politics, and the economy. And you can see how security and social affairs are the two highest. Great, well, saying gray doesn't really help, does it? But the middleweight gray, okay, this one. So somehow visually validates what has been said so far. And the second is actually an infographics taken by the Economist Intelligence Unit, showing how exactly thanks to these informal trans-regional partnerships, Eurasian and big parts of the global south have been managing to find compromise and room for cooperation and mutual development at the political and economic level, to the extent that now it has been traced that several states have changed their initial position on the war. And I think this is also saying something about loyalties, normativities, and understandings of rightfulness in global governance. The last institutional change before before short quotes and some figures and conclusions. So transnational developmentalism, it's a specific form of developmentalism that I understand as increasing understanding of trade, financial cooperation, investments, and infrastructural development that is progressively de-ideologized and more business-oriented, personal, and flexible, with less considerations for supposedly higher moral grounds. An example for everything and everyone, lack of conditionality. This, of course, is linked to a specific understanding of the practice of the market economy. If you remember at the very beginning, I said that many of these big norms are polysemic. Okay? They mean different things to different people. And this speaks to an understanding of the market economy premised on the idea of state capitalism, the visible hand, the paternalistic state, and export-oriented interventionism. Of course, with elements also of mercantilism and protectionism. But I should also say, before I'm attacked on this, that this doesn't amount to a rejection of free trade whatsoever. Free trade is very much the only rule in town. But it's its interpretation of its premises that is changing, with a much more prominent role of the state, a much more visible hand, and less emphasis on conditionalities, and political conditionalities especially. It's an understanding of capitalism and market economy somehow premised against the idea of the Washington Consensus, and perhaps Jason later in his presentation will elaborate on this. And we are observing this again at the two-level game, right, that I said before, both at the Eurasian and the global level. In Eurasia, we can see how Afghanistan is progressively being included in these multilateral informal formats at the regional level, not just with energy, but also with infrastructure, mining, shipments. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are using now Afghanistan as a transit country to reach the ports of Pakistan and India. Iran is becoming more and more entrenched in the regional order as well, again informally, thanks to trade, infrastructural, and economic cooperation. Just to give you some figures, Kazakhstan has increased its trade with Iran 20% only in the past year. And this is despite sanctions, despite this idea of Iran as a pariah state in the West. And Russian-Iranian cooperation is very much prominent, also on drones, building material, by the way. Oil networks are developing, somehow also challenging the idea of environmentalism as a norm in international relations. And there is, of course, the very tricky, the very delicate topic of secondary intermediate trade to cushion sanctions. The European Union, to give you an example, has, of course, suspended, impose sanctions on the Russian economy, but this has led to an increase of 300% trade with the Central Asian states. But these Central Asian states are still supplying Russia with re-exports from the European Union. And I have an interesting quote on this, de facto rendering sanctions somehow ineffective. And it's just as sanctions on goods, also on military equipment as well. At the global level, the actions and the practices of the G77 and China that have obstructed this year the convening of Guterres' Summit for the Future, aimed at reforming the United Nations agenda, because they want, and I read the official letter sent by the ambassador of Cuba to the United Nations, they don't want the summit to be held until all developmental issues have been addressed on the UN agenda. So development first, and then we do whatever you want. Exponential growth of South-South trade. I must confess, I didn't know this until I did research for this paper. South-South trade, in terms of value, is now higher than North-South trade. And I think this is also telling something about the way in which structurally global governance is being reoriented. Couple of minutes more? One or two. And also the restructuring of debt from the West to East that is slowly moving, again, from the West to actually China. Some quotes and figures. Really, I don't have to expand on this. It's just for you to read, to contextualize a little bit the argument made so far. But it's interesting that the Kazakh president mentioned at the Astana Global Forum last week the new crisis, Adam Tooze, poly crisis, these very fancy notions, but the war is not mentioned at all. Not at all. It's not one of the crises. Head of Trade and Foreign Trade and Economy Committee of the Kyrgyz Parliament is Ambek Mazaliev. Very interesting quote, okay, on sanctions. I will not read this out because it will take too much time, but you can see some very interesting normativities and resistance tropes, okay? Fathers, gendarme, frightening, and the like. President Putin, Kazakh, Iran, trade, as I mentioned before, and then some figures to understand more in context transactional developmentalism. In Central Asia, the average inflation is now 15.9% compared to 4% in 2021. Global food price index averaged 159.3 points in March 22, up 17.9% from February. Lebanon, Zimbabwe, Turkey, and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa experienced the highest rate of food price inflation. In countries like Kazakhstan, households on average spend 43% of their income. This is even higher in Nigeria. And the global demand for crude oil is poised to reach its highest volume ever in 2023. Okay? Now, in conclusion, as I said before, these are plausible trends: return of health sovereignty, informalization, and transactional developmentalism, undermining sovereignty as a responsibility, formalization, and liberal capitalism. But with what endgame? I'm not able to predict this, of course. I foresee three possible outcomes out of these trends. We are still very much in flux, and to give a firm prediction would be as foolish as arrogant, in my opinion. But I do see three possible trends. The first one is a fission in global governance, a complete rejection and a complete crumbling of current state of global governance. I see this as, frankly, implausible, that several ideas and norms within global governance are there to stay. Possibly we are now in a phase of duplication that is visible in contestation. The rise of alternative formats, the rise of regional-based understandings of governance that contest several of the meanings of global governance without fully rejecting it. The third outcome may be merging or synthesis, where in fact the grievances, the clashes, and the path-dependent sufferance and sorrow due to the way in which global governance was initially set up, premised on racism, exclusion, exploitation, domination, are ultimately resolved for a new global compact. But this somehow looks like, at this very moment, wishful thinking. And how the West will respond to these matters, both in pragmatic as in normative terms. And I finish here, sorry for taking a bit longer than scheduled. Thank you.
It's my honor to continue with our first panel, and it's even a greater honor and pleasure to introduce our last speaker before the lunch break, Jason Moyer, who is Program Associate for the Global Europe Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He is in Washington, D.C. He's a foreign policy professional, foreign policy practitioner, somebody whose affiliations read like the who is who list of think tanks and foreign policy institutions in Washington, D.C. He has been based at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he also coordinated the postdoctoral fellowship program for a number of years. He's also a fellow of the Transatlantic Leadership Network, and his thoughts have been published with very prestigious media outlets, including the Washington Post, The Hill, one that we also love to read, The National Interest, which is a very prestigious outlet, and his commentary has also been sought by networks like NPR and including, of course, also the New York Times. Jason is a graduate of the Georgetown University, and I will not fail to mention one detail which is very interesting. During his times at Georgetown, he was teaching assistant to the former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the first female Secretary of State, and that may also help to explain Jason's sympathy for this part of the world, for Central Europe. Jason is going to provide a very welcome, finalizing view on international order, multipolarity from Washington, D.C., and will elaborate, of course, also in this context, the future of transatlantic relations, which is, of course, also a very pertinent topic that we have not yet been able to touch upon. Jason, we are anxiously waiting for your remarks. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Benedikt. Thank you, Aista, for the kind invitation. And I'm enormously grateful to the University of Graz for welcoming us. Thank you all so much. As Benedikt mentioned, I am more of a practitioner and a policymaker. At the Wilson Center, we like to say that we try to bridge the gap between academia and policy. So that's kind of that's what I have in mind to do today. As mentioned, this is going to be a view from Washington. I will try to distill the Washington consensus as much as possible, as much as it exists these days. There's a plurality of different views, and I'll do the best I can. And I also welcome a lot of your questions and concerns, and I will try to relay those back to Washington to be, received by policymakers, decision makers, because I think that's a really important part of this conversation. So the title, Reimagining International Order, just to dive right into it, we're talking about reimagining this international order as we're seeing a tremendous period of flux that we haven't seen since 1945, 1989. The world as we know it is dramatically changing. And really how the coming years develop, how international leaders respond on both sides of the Atlantic, across the world, will really define the future of international order. This unipolar era of the United States that we've seen since the end of the Cold War is really coming to an end. And I think we're seeing now the rise of China, resurgent and aggressive Russia, and a stronger Europe emerge. And how those different great powers play off of one another will be absolutely pivotal to the future of the international order. We're already seeing this on display in Ukraine, in the Indo-Pacific. Already these great powers are coming into some element of competition. So today I'd like to start just by going through the US side of things. Then I'm going to turn briefly to China, just to build on some of the excellent points made by my colleague, Professor Xi. And then I'll turn to Europe. Much of my current research is focused on Europe and its emergence as a major power. And one of the things I'd like to unpack is why Europe isn't often considered in part of this great power literature, and how I see that changing in the coming years. So first, to turn to the United States, the elephant in the room. Why are we talking about international order in DC these days? Why are we talking about the United States' place in the order? It really was brought about by the previous US administration, President Trump. This really accelerated a lot of the discussions and made them very urgent and salient. We've had, I don't want to relitigate too many of his positions, but obviously he tried to reduce burdens, what he perceived as burdens on the United States, and he really focused a lot of his attention as president on imbalances in the world with Germany, with China. And as a lifelong resident of Washington, D.C., we really had a lot of concerns about what this would mean for our institutions, for the U.S. government itself, the structures underpinning our democracy, and the very checks and balances that protect and prevent abuses. We saw a lot of the systems and a lot of elements of institutions bend but not break, and I think that really showed their strength. These organizations have proven to be incredibly resilient. It also showed the strength of bureaucracy and how powerful entrenched ideologies can be. But obviously this impact, the impact of President Trump continues to this day. We just saw President Emmanuel Macron speaking in Bratislava at GlobeSec, where he brought up multiple times that there was a concern about future U.S. leadership and especially what the next election cycle might entail. And honestly, that's one of the major conversations I have with a lot of colleagues from Europe is what's going to happen with the next election cycle, which has already begun, believe it or not, even though we're still a ways away. I don't have a magic ball. I can't really tell you what's going to happen, but we do know a few things for sure. President Joe Biden has confirmed that he will be running again. He's the Democratic candidate. A lot of people weren't sure, given his age, given other elements of his presidency, whether that would actually be the case. And sure enough, he is running still. So now we're just waiting to see who emerges as the Republican frontrunner. Traditionally, the person who's leading in the polls at this stage of the election tends to not be the one to become the actual nominee, so we'll have to kind of wait and see. And of course, there's a legal element at play as well. We're waiting to see how that unfolds. And, you know, honestly, I completely share these concerns. I think the next U.S. president is going to dramatically define the U.S.'s role in the world. We know some things that have come to light in recent years. We know that President Trump talked about wanting to withdraw the U.S. from NATO if he had won a second term. And I mean, the security guarantees in Europe with allies in the Indo-Pacific, these are a major concern. And actually, if we look the next year, there's going to be a lot of turnover. We're seeing not only U.S. elections, but there's going to be a new European Commission in the next year. There'll be a new Secretary General of NATO announced later this year. And so there's going to be a lot of turmoil and potential at the same time. So to kind of start to segue to China, you know, we have seen this very tense U.S.-China relationship. It really is something that was more prevalent in U.S. presidential campaigns, but at some point it used to be left on the campaign trail, but it's actually kind of continued into multiple administrations. The Biden administration is largely continuing the policy of the Trump administration in China, which was somewhat surprising. And we see this real push by the U.S. government to define countries as either democratic or autocratic, with the idea of the U.S. leading what it refers to as the West, the free world, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and then you have China and Russia on the other side of this ideological divide, which is kind of, it bears a lot of resemblances to the Cold War era. It's this very black and white thinking. And yeah, I mean, U.S.-China relations are at an all-time low, which is very disappointing to see. It's not a very productive relationship right now, and I think that's the biggest thing. I think it's important that the U.S. and China get back to a more productive place. I think too often we get caught up in this idea of China as this boogeyman who's coming for the U.S., and really there's a lot more to unpack there. China has its fair share of challenges too. We talked about security issues with regards to Taiwan, India. Our colleague Professor Shi mentioned the challenges the Belt and Road Initiative has faced, and I would especially like to hear her thoughts when we have a moment on how this is playing out across Europe. And of course, there's this emerging middle class in China, and how that plays out will also define the future of China's role on the global stage. It's also been really interesting for me to follow Europe's development of a China policy. There's been a lot of discussion about whether there is a single China policy at the EU level, how this trickles down to individual member states. I think we're actively seeing this conversation unfold. And of course, this is obviously predicated on individual countries' relationships with China, whether that's economic, whether that's bilateral. And I think we used to have this kind of idea of welcoming China as an international leader and making sure that it was a positive member to the state of international order. And I think somehow we've kind of abandoned that line of thinking. And I think we almost need to go back to that as a potential way forward. China is a disruptor to the international status quo, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think just as we reimagine the future of the international order, we have to take into account this China element and what role they should play. So where does that leave Europe? And I think, I already mentioned that we're seeing the emergence of this China policy. I think President von der Leyen and President Macron's trip to China earlier this year was enormously enlightening and represented quite a few steps forward in that clarification of policy. You had President von der Leyen in her Merrick speech outline China and stress that they were trying to de-risk and not decouple. And then there's also the security angle. I think the war in Ukraine has really shown that there is still this very tacit European connection between the United States and Europe for security matters. And to what extent that is a good thing or a bad thing, I think we can talk about. And this notion of European strategic autonomy, which doesn't always get the best reception in Washington. It's often mischaracterized, sometimes by President Macron himself. But as these conversations develop, and whether that also is adopted across Europe, will be especially interesting to keep an eye on. Because I recognize that it's not a policy that's accepted by all the different European countries. And even though France and to a certain extent the EU is pushing for this notion of European strategic autonomy, it's still in a lot of parts of Europe quite controversial. Really, we talk about how Ukraine has changed everything. That's been kind of like the main thing that I've been researching in the last few years, this European security renaissance that we're witnessing, from individual countries announcing record increases to their military and defense spending, to historic policy shifts, from Germany's Zeitenwende, upending decades of policy that Germany had towards Russia. From Denmark, we have the historic undoing via referendum of a defense opt-out, and this is something that dates back to the 1990s. So this was the first time that this was inconceivable just a few years ago, and now here we are. Finland and Sweden are joining NATO. For decades, those countries have kind of grappled with this decision of whether or not to join NATO as a defensive alliance, and we now finally have an answer to that, as Finland has now been fully joined, and we're awaiting further ratification from Sweden. And I think in part this gets back to kind of the main question of where is Europe in this great power competition. Sometimes the literature excludes Europe and focuses more on the US, China, sometimes Russia. But I would almost argue that Russia, as we've seen play out in Ukraine, is not maybe necessarily the power we thought it was. I think that that's kind of up for debate. And I think instead we should be considering Europe more as a great power. Frequently it was cited that there was no military element to Europe, or that was lacking, and so that's why they were being excluded. But as we're seeing on display in Ukraine, we're seeing record amounts of military aid being provided, both investment and actually providing of arms for the first time by the European Union. So just to kind of briefly conclude, this reimagined world order, what does it look like? I foresee that we are heading towards a multipolar world with China, the US, and Europe. China will continue to be a major player in multiple parts of the world, along its Belt and Road Initiative, Southeast Asia, Africa, but ultimately it won't replace the US. I think it's still going to be a matter of the US defining cultural, economic, and security realms. Europe has an incredibly unique opportunity to, at times, support the US, but also to pave its own path where it disagrees with the United States. Good friends can often disagree and can be our harshest critics, but I think that's healthy, and it keeps the United States from overstepping in a lot of ways. There are rogue states such as Russia, Iran, North Korea, that will continue to be irritants, but I don't know that they're going to continue to drive a lot of the discourse surrounding great power competition. And it's really difficult to predict what engagement with Russia will look like moving forward. A number of my colleagues at the Wilson Center are trying to look at where there will be potential areas of collaboration between the US, Russia, and even between Europe and Russia. Traditionally, there are a number of international organizations that underpin these relationships. but at this point, there's very little dialogue between the US and Russia. The OSCE, headquartered in Vienna, is currently the only transatlantic organization with both the United States and Russia as members. So perhaps some kind of dialogue can begin there once the conflict and the fighting stops. And then last, I just want to talk about European strategic autonomy. It's become this very politicized term in a lot of ways, and I think that there's a real concern that it becomes a topic that is not universally accepted, even though individual countries are making steps towards implementing strategic autonomy, albeit without using that term. So as that term becomes kind of more loaded, it's something where we're gonna have to see how these debates play out. I think for the most part, most countries in Europe are moving towards greater defense spending, greater acknowledgement of their security and military capabilities, and that, of course, makes Europe a better ally to the United States, and it also allows for a certain degree of independence. So with that, I'll stop. I look forward to hearing your questions, and thank you.